The winds of change had swept across the grand streets of Paris for years, bringing with them the fervor of revolution and the promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, for one woman, an enigmatic beauty from the far-flung Caribbean island of Martinique, the storm that tore through France was not merely a political upheaval but the upheaval of her very identity. Her name was Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie, but history would come to know her simply as Joséphine. Born into a family that was once part of the colonial aristocracy, Josephine's early life in the tropics had been shaped by privilege but also by loss. She lost her father to misfortune, and later, she lost her first husband to the guillotine. It was an era where the brutal hand of revolution did not care for noble birth or gentle manners. It cared only for power. And for Joséphine, power was a force both to be feared and, in some ways, to be embraced. But even as France burned with the fires of revolt, Joséphine stood at the precipice of something far greater than she could have imagined. The end of her first marriage, to the noble and tragic Alexander de Beauharnais, set the stage for an unexpected union with a rising general, a Corsican with a singular ambition to shape the fate of Europe. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. As she looked out over the riotous streets of Paris from the safety of her well-appointed home, Joséphine could hardly have known that her future, her fate, and the future of France itself were about to collide in a union that would change history forever. The daughter of a wealthy plantation owner in the Caribbean, Joséphine's childhood had been one of idyllic tranquility, nestled among the sugarcane fields and the tropical sun. But even as a young girl, she was aware of the simmering discontent that occasionally reached the shores of the island. Still, she could never have imagined how quickly the world would change. In her early 20s, Joséphine's life took a sudden, dark turn. Her marriage to Alexander de Beauharnais, a promising French aristocrat, seemed to promise a life of luxury and social standing. But Alexander, a man of deep political convictions, would become ensnared by the revolution's wrath. He was executed by guillotine in 1794, leaving Joséphine a widow in a time of violent political chaos. Yet it was precisely this period of turmoil that would set her on the path to a greater destiny. As France struggled with its new republican identity, Joséphine found herself a part of the intricate web of Parisian society. As a widow with no title and few connections, she was forced to navigate the dangerous politics of the day, attending salons and forging alliances with revolutionary figures, some of whom would later become her enemies. It was within this heady mix of politics, ambition, and raw survival that she met Napoleon Bonaparte. The Caribbean winds swept through the streets of Les Trois Islets, a small town in Martinique, where young Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie, soon to be known as Joséphine, was born. The year was 1763. Her family was not of royal blood, yet they belonged to the French aristocracy in the colonies, a privileged position that would shape her destiny in ways she could scarcely imagine. Joséphine's world was one of sugar plantations, sprawling estates, and a society built upon the toil of enslaved people. The island was a paradise of wealth, but also one of deep inequalities, where colonial power and European ambitions intertwined with cruelty and oppression. Raised by her mother, who had hopes of elevating the family's social standing, Joséphine was taught the ways of refinement and elegance, expected to attract a wealthy suitor. Yet, as a child, she was far from the poised woman she would become. With a rebellious streak, she often ran barefoot through the sugarcane fields, feeling the earth between her toes, dreaming of something more than a life confined by plantation walls. Her early years on Martinique were marked by privilege, but also by the simmering unrest of a colony under French control. The winds of revolution in France were far-reaching, and their effects would soon be felt across the ocean. But long before she would become entwined with the future of France, Joséphine's path would take a dark and unexpected turn. At the age of 16, Joséphine married Alexander de Beauharnais, a young officer in the French army. After being swept off her feet by his charm, The marriage, though passionate at first, soon became strained as Alexander's military career took him far from their home, leaving Joséphine in Paris. The vibrant, chaotic city was worlds away from the plantation life she had once known. In Paris, she was introduced to the political upheaval that would shake the foundation of France, the French Revolution. It was here, amidst the swirling political intrigues of the day, that Joséphine's life began its dramatic transformation. Her husband, Alexander, was soon swept up in the fever of revolution. He became involved with the more radical elements of the revolutionary government. And in 1794, during the height of the terror, he was executed by guillotine. A widow at the age of 32, Joséphine was left in a city reeling from violence, poverty, and fear. But survival was an art she had mastered, unlike so many others who fell victim to the revolution's brutal waves. Joséphine possessed a strength of character that allowed her to endure the seemingly insurmountable odds against her. She became part of a new elite in Paris, one that existed not just in the salons, but in the shadows of power. As the Republic moved from one phase to the next, Joséphine's name began to be whispered in influential circles. Yet, the prospect of a new marriage was no longer what she had once envisioned. It was during this chaotic time that Joséphine crossed paths with a man who would change her life in ways she could never have predicted: Napoleon Bonaparte. The first time Joséphine met Napoleon, he was a young, ambitious general who had recently returned from his Italian campaign. He was tall, dark-eyed, and exuded a commanding presence. She, on the other hand, was a woman marked by the scars of a tumultuous past, a widow, a mother, and a survivor. Their initial meeting, though seemingly unremarkable, set the stage for a romance that would alter the course of history. Napoleon, who was nearly a decade younger than Joséphine, was immediately struck by her beauty and sophistication. Yet, it was not just her appearance that intrigued him, it was her resilience. Unlike many women of her time, Joséphine had not been defeated by the tragedies of her life. She had learned to navigate the complexities of Parisian society with grace, adapting to the shifting tides of political power. For Joséphine, Napoleon was a revelation. He was different from the men she had known, ruthless, ambitious, and determined to carve his name into history. He seemed, first, a mere soldier with grand dreams, but there was an intensity about him that stirred something deep within her. He was not just seeking power, he was creating it, and in that creation, she saw a reflection of her own struggle for identity, for survival, and for love. Their romance was not without its challenges. Joséphine was older than Napoleon, and the fact that she was already a widow with 2 children did not fit neatly into the image of a perfect match that society might have expected. Yet, their chemistry was undeniable. As Napoleon rose through the ranks, his ambition was matched only by Joséphine's desire for security and influence. She had lived through enough to know that love, while important, was often secondary to the power that could protect you from the ravages of the world. Napoleon's love for Joséphine was intense and obsessive. He was captivated by her elegance, her charm, and her ability to remain calm in even the most chaotic of circumstances. For him, she was a symbol of stability in a world that was constantly in flux. But Joséphine, while deeply moved by his passion, was still a woman shaped by years of loss, and she often found herself torn between her love for him and the security of her independence. As their relationship deepened, Napoleon's power grew. In 1799, he staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the French government and establishing himself as first consul. With this rise, Joséphine's place in French society became more secure, but her personal life began to unravel. Napoleon's ambitions did not stop at political power. They extended to the creation of a dynasty, one that he hoped would last for centuries. But Joséphine, though deeply in love with him, could not provide him with an heir. Their marriage, once full of promise, now faced its most difficult test. Through these years, Joséphine's resilience would be tested as never before. as the country of France underwent a transformation that would change the course of history. Joséphine found herself caught between the roles of the dutiful wife, the royal consort, and the woman who, despite everything, could never entirely let go of the pain of the past. It was clear that her journey had only just begun. The year was 1794. Joséphine had never imagined that her world, which had once been so comfortably nestled in the tropical calm of Martinique, would soon be engulfed by the roiling storm of revolution. Her first marriage to Alexander de Beauharnais, a man she had married out of duty rather than love, had ended in tragedy. Alexander had been executed by the guillotine, a casualty of the reign of terror that was sweeping through France. She was left a widow, with 2 young children to raise and a heart broken by grief. Yet, as she gazed out over the bay in Martinique, a sense of inevitability gripped her. The winds of change that had reached Paris were now calling her back to the motherland, and there was no escaping her destiny. She sailed from the shores of Martinique in 1795, her heart heavy with sorrow, yet with the faintest flicker of hope. France, though scarred by years of revolution, still glittered with the promise of a new world order. Paris was a city of power and intrigue, where the once mighty aristocracy had fallen, and new men were rising. Joséphine, a widow and an outsider, knew that in order to survive, she would need to master the art of reinvention. Paris was no longer the elegant city of old. The revolution had torn down the palaces and the aristocratic facades, but it had not yet cleansed the air of its volatile politics. The streets were alive with the clatter of revolutionaries, the echoes of executions still ringing in the memories of those who had witnessed them. Yet for Joséphine, Paris was a place of possibility. She quickly ingratiated herself with the new social elite, a world of soldiers, politicians, and artists, people who were eager to reinvent themselves in the aftermath of the revolution. Her beauty, grace, and composure made her an irresistible figure in the salons of Paris. But Joséphine was not merely a passive player in this new world. She had learned from her past, from the loss of her first husband and the shifting tides of fortune. Paris, after all, was not just a city of power, it was a city of opportunity for women who knew how to navigate its complex web of alliances. And Joséphine had always been a woman of resilience. Her path crossed with that of Napoleon Bonaparte in the most unexpected way. Napoleon, at that time, was still a rising star, a young, ambitious general with dreams of greatness. He was a man with fire in his eyes and a mind that could calculate strategy with cold precision. But he was also a man in need of connection. As a soldier who had risen from humble beginnings, Napoleon knew the importance of appearances, and Joséphine, with her air of dignity and grace, presented herself as the perfect companion for a man like him. Their first meeting, in 1795, was one of intrigue and caution. Joséphine, already 32, was older than Napoleon, yet her beauty and wit captivated him. He, on the other hand, was a brash, self-assured officer who saw in Joséphine not just a potential ally, but a woman who could elevate his position. Their courtship was marked by both fervent admiration and underlying tension. While Napoleon was deeply in love with her, Joséphine's affections were more measured. She had been through too much, lost too much, to give herself wholly to anyone again. Yet, the chemistry between them was undeniable. Napoleon, driven by his ambition and youthful passion, courted her relentlessly. He wrote her letters filled with longing and promises of grandeur. Joséphine, in turn, played the role of the mysterious, elusive woman who seemed both distant and irresistibly alluring. She was, after all, not simply a widow seeking love. She was a woman who had seen the rise and fall of men, and who understood the ways of power. As their relationship blossomed, Paris became the stage for their dramatic love affair. Joséphine attended the theaters, the ballrooms, and the cafes, always at the heart of the social whirl. Her charm was unparalleled, and her presence was magnetic. Napoleon, meanwhile, continued to rise through the ranks of the military, making a name for himself not only as a brilliant strategist but also as a man of exceptional ambition. He had already tasted victory in Italy and was now eyeing the power corridors of Paris. However, beneath the surface of their relationship, cracks began to form. Joséphine, while captivated by Napoleon's determination and success, struggled with her own feelings. She had once been a woman of wealth and comfort, but now she was a widow, thrust into the uncertain world of post-revolutionary France. Though she had grown to care for Napoleon, she also knew that her survival was tied not only to his affections but to his ability to protect and advance her in a society that still viewed her as an outsider. In Napoleon, Joséphine saw both a partner and a pawn in the game of politics. She knew that his meteoric rise could only be made possible by an alliance with someone of her stature, someone with connections to the old world, yet still adaptable to the new. Their relationship, while passionate, was also strategic. Joséphine was not blind to the opportunities he presented, and she was no stranger to the art of maneuvering in a society where power was the ultimate currency. One evening, at a lavish ball held in one of the grand Parisian hotels, Joséphine and Napoleon had a quiet conversation in a shadowed corner. It was there that Napoleon, unable to contain his feelings any longer, proposed to her. His words were simple, yet full of promise. "I will make you Empress of France," he said, his voice low and steady. "Together, we will rule Europe." Josephine's heart raced. She had never been one to give in to a man's desires so easily, but the ambition in Napoleon's eyes was too compelling to resist. And so, despite her reservations, she said yes. They were married in a private ceremony on March 9th, 1796. A union of both passion and politics, of love and power, but their journey was just beginning, and the road ahead would be paved with both triumphs and heartaches. As Joséphine gazed out at the city from the window of their apartment, the world seemed to be at her feet, but she knew, deep down, that this marriage to Napoleon was not just about love, it was about survival, ambition, and the ever-present game of power. Little did she know that within the next decade, she would be crowned as the Empress of France, a title that would bring her both glory and immense personal sacrifice. The streets of Paris had never been more alive, nor had they ever felt so dangerous. In 1796, when Joséphine arrived in the city, the revolution was still fresh in everyone's memory. The guillotine, a symbol of terror, had not yet been fully silenced, though its shadow hung over everything. The people of Paris, and indeed of France, had lived through the storm, but the question on everyone's lips was the same: what would come next? In the midst of this uncertainty, Joséphine de Beauharnais, widow of the executed aristocrat Alexander de Beauharnais, was an unlikely figure to become a part of history's grand narrative. Yet, as with so many others, fate had its own designs for her. Her first days in Paris were spent in the salons of the revolutionaries, where ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity had once burned like a fire but were now smoldering under the weight of political betrayal. The French Republic, so recently born out of bloodshed, was beginning to show the cracks of its unstable foundation. Joséphine, with her grace and charm, quickly learned to navigate the complex political landscape. Her beauty, intellect, and connections to powerful men allowed her to rise above the tumult. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was an embodiment of the volatile crossroads between France's past and its uncertain future. One evening, at a soirée thrown by a prominent general, a man stepped into the room, and everything changed. He was not a man of refinement or nobility, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen battlefields, who had conquered both enemies and his own doubts. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, a rising star in the French military, had been at the forefront of the campaigns in Italy. His exploits were already making waves, and whispers of his genius were spreading across Europe. He was not the tall, elegant figure that the aristocratic women of Paris might have expected. Instead, he was shorter than most, with a fiery ambition that could burn through anyone who stood in his way. He had come to Paris to secure his place in the world, and he had plans that, as it would turn out, would forever change the course of history. When Joséphine and Napoleon met, their connection was immediate, though not entirely love at first sight. Joséphine, at 32, was older than Napoleon by several years. She had 2 children, a history that had marked her with the stain of widowhood, and a reputation as a woman who had weathered the storms of the Revolution. Napoleon, though smitten by her beauty, was initially uncertain of her. He was ambitious and driven, and his rising career meant that he had no time to fall into a quiet domestic life. Yet, there was something in Joséphine's eyes, something that spoke to him of a kindred spirit. Perhaps it was the way she had survived the tumult of her life, the strength in her that he himself recognized in his own struggle to rise. Or perhaps it was simply her grace, which reminded him of a world he had never known but longed to claim. The relationship between them grew quickly, though not without tension. Joséphine was cautious, her heart having been broken by the Revolution and her previous marriage. She was no longer a naive young woman. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of political and personal betrayal. But with Napoleon, there was a magnetic pull that she could not deny. His energy, his ambition, and his obsession with power were intoxicating. In him, she saw the possibility of a new future, not just for France, but for herself. For Napoleon, the decision was more straightforward. He was a man who believed in destiny, and Joséphine, with all her complexities, seemed to fit into that destiny. He proposed to her in a way that was not romantic but rather practical, as though it were a calculated step in his quest for dominance. Yet, beneath his ambitions, there was a fierce affection for her, a desire to possess not just her body, but her heart. He admired her ability to navigate the social intricacies of Paris, her charm, and the way she carried herself with a dignity that, to him, was above reproach. Napoleon and Joséphine were married on March 9, 1796. Their union was one of political calculation and personal passion, though at times it seemed that the balance was precarious. Joséphine, as much as she had fallen for Napoleon's ambition, could not entirely silence the fears and scars left by the years of revolution. She understood the precariousness of power in this new world. She had already seen one man she loved fall to the guillotine. Could Napoleon be different? Could he truly change the course of France? Or would he, too, fall victim to the forces he had so carefully manipulated? Despite these uncertainties, Joséphine's position in Napoleon's life seemed secure. His military success had brought him glory and political capital, and his relationship with her allowed him to solidify his status. Through her connections and political acumen, Joséphine helped smooth over the rough edges of his public image, and together they were a formidable pair. Napoleon, the conqueror, and Joséphine, the queenly figure by his side. But the tension between ambition and love was palpable. Napoleon, ever driven, was focused on his campaigns, and Joséphine, who had hoped for a quieter life of influence and luxury, found herself increasingly alone. She had always been a woman accustomed to being the center of attention, and Napoleon's rising career was pulling him away from her. Their relationship, though deep, was complicated by their differing desires. Joséphine longed for the comforts of a stable, refined life, while Napoleon's hunger for power seemed insatiable. During these years, Joséphine would find herself torn between supporting her husband's ambitions and struggling to maintain the warmth of their marriage. The political landscape of France shifted beneath them like the tides, and Napoleon's meteoric rise brought with it its own set of dangers. But for Joséphine, the most difficult challenge was not the shifting allegiances of the political elite, nor the impending conflicts that loomed on the horizon. It was the deep, aching loneliness she sometimes felt at his side. Could a woman of her experience and desires ever find true peace with a man whose ambitions burned brighter than the stars themselves? Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power was as rapid as it was audacious. By 1804, the world had watched in awe as the young general from Corsica had transformed from a revolutionary hero to the self-crowned emperor of the French. His ambition, sharp as a blade, matched the ambition of the era itself. In a world where power was won by force and cunning, Napoleon was a man of destiny, and Joséphine, by his side, was the woman who would help him carve that destiny into the annals of history. But Joséphine, ever the survivor, was no stranger to the turbulence of history, despite her deep affection for Napoleon. The role of Empress of the French was one she had not expected to play, and it was a role that would come with its own set of trials. Their marriage had been an extraordinary one, passionate, tumultuous, and filled with contradictions. Joséphine had been captivated by Napoleon's ambition, his fiery determination, and his vision for a new France, but she had also been deeply aware of her own position in his life, one that was as much a political arrangement as it was a personal relationship. Napoleon, for all his love for her, had begun to recognize that Joséphine could not provide him with the one thing he desired most, a male heir. The rumors of their struggles began to surface in the high society of Paris. Joséphine had been unable to bear Napoleon a son, and though she had given him 2 children from her first marriage, Eugene and Hortense, Napoleon's eyes had already begun to wander toward the idea of securing a bloodline of his own. The stakes had never been higher. In the background, the political calculations of the French Empire were shifting, and Josephine's future with Napoleon seemed uncertain. Yet, for all the whispers and the uncertainties, Joséphine remained the empress, standing tall in the face of France's ever-changing tides. The day of the coronation arrived in 1804. The streets of Paris were filled with anticipation, a grand spectacle of power and opulence. The coronation of Napoleon was no ordinary royal ceremony. It was a declaration to the world that the French Revolution had not only overthrown the old regime, but had also given birth to a new order, a new dynasty. Joséphine, elegant in her regal robes, stood beside Napoleon in Notre Dame Cathedral, a symbol of the country's defiance against its old aristocracy and its reimagining of power. As the Archbishop of Reims began the sacred rites of the coronation, Napoleon, without hesitation, took the crown from the priest's hands and placed it upon his own head. In an act that would become one of the most iconic moments in history, he did not wait for divine right. He declared his own sovereignty, and, as tradition dictated, Joséphine was crowned by his side, the new Empress of the French. The spectacle was magnificent. Thousands of citizens lined the streets, gazing upon the imperial procession as it moved through the heart of Paris. The crowds cheered, the banners flew, and Napoleon's grand ambitions were finally realized. But behind the grand pageantry, Joséphine's heart was filled with a quiet sadness, for she knew that the empire Napoleon had created was not just a monument to their love. It was also a reflection of the growing distance between them. As empress, Joséphine held her position with grace, using her charm and intelligence to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics. She was deeply involved in the cultural and social life of the empire, hosting grand events and supporting the arts. But beneath the surface, her relationship with Napoleon was unraveling. Napoleon, who had once been so infatuated with her, began to grow impatient with her inability to give him a male heir. His love for her remained, but it was overshadowed by his ambition. Joséphine, ever the astute observer, recognized the shift in their relationship. She had never been able to fulfill his greatest desire, fathering a son to secure the Bonaparte dynasty. As the years passed, Napoleon's frustration began to take a toll on their marriage, and rumors of his infidelities spread throughout the empire. Joséphine, though deeply hurt, never lost her composure. She understood the delicate balance between love and power in their marriage. She was the empress, But Napoleon's dreams of dynastic succession were not hers to control. In the privacy of her chambers, Joséphine would often reflect on the complexity of her situation. She had been a young widow in Martinique, uncertain of her place in the world. Now, she was Empress of the French, married to one of the most powerful men in Europe. Yet she felt an emptiness that even the grandeur of her position could not fill. The empire had become Napoleon's obsession, and Joséphine was both a part of it and apart from it. As the years went on, Joséphine's role as empress became increasingly ceremonial. She accompanied Napoleon on his travels, presided over court functions, and was adored by the French people. But her personal life was marked by growing isolation. The one constant in her life was the love she had for her children, Eugene and Hortense, both of whom had been taken into the heart of the Bonaparte family. Eugene, Napoleon's adopted son, rose to prominence in the imperial army, while Hortense, Napoleon's stepdaughter, was married to Napoleon's brother, Louis Bonaparte. Joséphine's family, though not born of Napoleon's blood, had become entwined with his empire in ways that were both political and personal. But despite her resilience, the tension between Joséphine and Napoleon continued to build. The whispers of divorce grew louder, and Joséphine's place as empress was increasingly uncertain. The man who had once been captivated by her elegance and charm now seemed more interested in the future of his empire than in the woman who had once been his heart's desire. And so, as the winds of fate shifted once again, Joséphine's reign as empress was nearing its end. But her story was far from over. It was a marriage forged in the fires of revolution. But as the years passed, the once blazing passion between Joséphine and Napoleon began to flicker. The year was 1809, and the grandeur of the imperial court had reached its zenith. The Tuileries Palace, with its glittering halls and extravagant feasts, was the beating heart of the empire. Napoleon, now Emperor of France, had already conquered much of Europe. His name was whispered in awe from the courts of Vienna to the streets of Moscow. But beneath the polished surface of his empire, tensions simmered. Joséphine had given him everything she could: her loyalty, her love, and her unshakable belief in his greatness. But as with so many marriages born of ambition, their bond had begun to fracture. The once unshakable trust between them began to wane, replaced by the cold, calculating demands of empire. The first signs of strain appeared in the form of children, or the lack thereof. Joséphine, though a mother to 2 children from her first marriage, had not borne Napoleon an heir. For a man as determined to build a lasting dynasty as he was, this was a glaring deficiency. Though Joséphine had been a loyal and devoted wife, Napoleon's desire for a male heir led him to seek a divorce. The decision, though inevitable in Napoleon's mind, was a painful one. He had built his empire with the blood of soldiers and the fire of ambition. But the dissolution of his marriage to Joséphine was a bitter pill to swallow. He loved her still, in his own way, but love had to yield to the cold, hard logic of power. He needed a successor, a dynasty. Joséphine, ever the pragmatist, understood the inevitability of the decision. She had known Napoleon for years, and she had seen how his ambitions outgrew even his deepest affections. Yet, the pain of the separation was palpable. She had stood by him through the dark days of his rise to power, had watched as he became the Emperor of the French, and had borne the weight of his crown as if it were her own. Now, she was to be cast aside in favor of a younger woman, a woman who could provide the heir Napoleon so desperately sought. In a moment of introspection, Joséphine considered the cost of ambition. She had been swept up in the tides of history, a woman at the side of a man destined to change the world. But at what cost? Her heart was broken, yet there was no room for self-pity in the world she inhabited. She had known grief and loss before, and she would survive again. As Napoleon's desire for an heir grew more urgent, the French court buzzed with gossip and intrigue. His relationship with Joséphine had always been fraught with contradictions. But now, The emperor's need for a new wife became the focal point of the empire. The stakes were high, not just for the imperial family, but for the future of France itself. The pressures of empire weighed heavily on both of them. Napoleon had achieved almost everything he had set out to do. He had transformed France into a European superpower. Yet, in his heart, there was a gnawing sense of something incomplete, something missing. His glory on the battlefield had not brought him peace. The throne he had built was sturdy, but it lacked the personal fulfillment he had once found in Joséphine. For her part, Joséphine knew that the end of her marriage to Napoleon would not be the end of her life. She had survived the revolution, the fall of the monarchy, and the rise of an emperor. She would survive this, too. But what would her future look like? The court had moved on to a new chapter, one in which she no longer played the starring role. As she walked through the vast gardens of the Tuileries, Joséphine could not help but reflect on how far she had come. She had once been a girl from the Caribbean, the daughter of a plantation owner, destined for a life of obscurity. Now, she was the Empress of France, a woman who had shaped the course of history. Yet, despite all her achievements, it was love that had eluded her, the one thing she could not control. Napoleon's decision to divorce Joséphine would have far-reaching consequences, not just for their personal lives, but for the future of France. The empire, for all its grandeur, was a fragile construct, held together by the will of a single man. And as Joséphine prepared to leave the palace she had once ruled, she knew that the era of the Napoleonic Empire was entering a new phase, one that would forever change her life, and the lives of those who followed her. The year was 1810, and the imperial court at the Tuileries was draped in the heavy silks of extravagance. Yet, despite the outward signs of prosperity, Joséphine de Beauharnais felt an inescapable weight upon her heart. She had once been the unrivaled Empress of the French, standing by Napoleon's side as he led the armies of France to conquer the continent. But now, her position, once unshakable, was beginning to crumble. Napoleon had become more distant. His relentless ambition had driven him to seek an heir at all costs, and Joséphine, unable to provide him with a son, was increasingly seen as a symbol of his personal and political limitations. It was a fate that she had feared for some time, though it still cut deep when reality finally set in. Her heart was torn. Joséphine had loved Napoleon, had been swept up in the grandeur of his vision for a new France, for a new European order under his reign. She had supported him, believed in him even when the odds were stacked against them. She had borne his title with grace and dignity, and yet, as the years passed, she began to realize that love alone could not hold an empire together. In the early months of 1810, Napoleon's resolve hardened. His need for an heir had become a matter of political survival. The stability of the empire, built upon the dreams of his military conquests, depended on the bloodline he would leave behind. And though Joséphine had given him everything she could, her devotion, her passion, her support, she could not fulfill this most basic requirement. Napoleon, after much deliberation, made the painful decision to divorce Joséphine and marry the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, Marie-Louise. The political alliance was as cold and calculated as Napoleon himself. But it was also a betrayal that cut Joséphine to the core. The news of the divorce spread quickly through the halls of the palace. The courtiers, ever the opportunists, whispered in the corridors, sensing that the fragile balance of power in the empire was about to shift once again. But Joséphine, though heartbroken, accepted the inevitable with the dignity that had always been her trademark. She knew that her position as empress was over. Napoleon would move on, as he always did, with ambition as his guide. And though she was no longer his wife, she remained, in a way, part of his world. In the weeks following the announcement, Joséphine withdrew from the court. Her new life was one of quiet reflection, away from the tumult of imperial politics. She returned to her private residence, the Château de Malmaison, where she had once entertained guests and hosted grand galas as the Empress of France. Now, the halls were empty, and the silence was broken only by the occasional visitor, friends who still sought her company, but who knew that the world around them was shifting. She spent her days tending to her gardens, a sanctuary she had created during her time as empress. The flowers, lush and fragrant, seemed to offer her a solace that the grand palaces of Paris could never provide. Joséphine had always been a lover of nature, and her gardens at Malmaison had become her refuge, a place where she could find peace away from the sharp edges of courtly life. Despite the pain of the divorce, Josephine's heart still held a deep affection for Napoleon. She never fully understood why their love had faltered. Perhaps it was simply the weight of his ambition, which had consumed him as it had consumed so many others. Or perhaps it was the demands of empire, an empire that had grown too large for one man to control, and too fragile to withstand the strain of internal and external pressures. As Napoleon married Marie-Louise in a grand ceremony, the echoes of their once passionate love seemed to fade into the background of history. Joséphine, now exiled from the world of power and politics, retreated into a life of quiet dignity. She was no longer the empress, but she was still a figure of importance in French society, admired for her resilience and grace. Yet, the shadow of Napoleon was never far from her life. She followed his campaigns, as she always had, with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knew that his empire, built on the bones of countless battles, was beginning to show signs of cracking. The Russian campaign of 1812, in which Napoleon's army suffered devastating losses, was a turning point. The glory that had once seemed so assured now appeared to be slipping through his fingers. Joséphine, in her solitude, reflected on her own life and the choices she had made. She had once been a symbol of revolutionary France, a woman who had weathered the storms of revolution and empire with grace. Now, she was a relic of a bygone era, a woman who had loved and lost, who had once been at the center of history and was now relegated to the sidelines. But even in her quiet exile, Joséphine's influence lingered. Her personal style, her fashion, her approach to diplomacy, and her ability to navigate the complexities of the political world had left a lasting impact on the court of Napoleon and the empire itself. Her legacy would live on, not in the titles she had once held, but in the hearts of those who remembered her as more than just the wife of an emperor. In the final years of her life, Joséphine found a semblance of peace. She passed her days in the company of her children, her friends, and the few loyal servants who had stayed with her. Though Napoleon's empire would eventually fall, and he would be exiled to the island of St. Helena, Joséphine remained a figure of compassion and resilience, a woman who had lived through the rise and fall of an empire. When Joséphine passed away in 1814, it was a quiet death, away from the grandeur and spectacle of her earlier years. She was buried in the church at Rouen, a small, peaceful place far removed from the pomp and circumstance of her imperial life. The world had moved on, but Joséphine's legacy of love, of loss, of survival remained a part of history, etched into the story of Napoleon Bonaparte and the empire he had built, and in the hearts of those who would remember her as a woman who had been both a queen and a survivor. The year was 1814, and the once mighty empire that Napoleon had built was on the brink of collapse. The emperor, who had once conquered vast swathes of Europe with the fervor of a man with a mission, was now exiled to the island of Elba. His dreams of empire had crumbled under the weight of military defeats, political betrayal, and the endless tide of war. But through it all, Joséphine de Beauharnais, the woman who had stood by his side in the most triumphant and tumultuous years of his rise, was once again facing the quiet, solitary existence that had defined so much of her life. Her world had changed irrevocably. No longer the Empress of the French, no longer the wife of the emperor, Joséphine found herself in a position she had never truly imagined, a position of estrangement from the man she had loved so deeply, yet whom she had also been forced to let go. It was a bitter, yet inevitable end to a chapter in history that had been written in the blood and ambition of both her husband and herself. For Joséphine, the hardest part of her life in the final years of her marriage to Napoleon was not the public displays of their fractured union, but the private pain. She had once been a woman of strength and grace, a survivor of revolution and war, and the mother of 2 children who had seen her through the storm. Yet now, as she sat in the silence of her rooms in the Tuileries, surrounded by the vestiges of a court that had been reduced to whispers and rumors, she often felt a sense of desolation creeping into her soul. Napoleon's desire for an heir had been the final blow to their marriage. The emperor had grown impatient with Josephine's inability to give him a son. His longing for a male heir led him to make the devastating decision to divorce her in 1810, replacing her with the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, in hopes of securing a dynastic future. The divorce, though civil, was a public humiliation for Joséphine, who had sacrificed so much for Napoleon's glory. Yet, she remained outwardly composed, never allowing the world to see the depth of her hurt. She had tried to convince herself that her love for Napoleon had not been the blind passion it once was, but a deeper, more enduring respect for the man who had reshaped Europe. Yet the truth remained, despite their growing distance. Despite the cold letters and the distant courtesies, she still loved him. Perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. In the years following her divorce, Joséphine withdrew from the political machinations of the court, seeking solace in her private life. She returned to her estate at Malmaison, where she had once spent so many happy years with Napoleon before the weight of empire had consumed him. There, surrounded by the gardens she had cultivated with such care, Joséphine tried to find peace. She took solace in the company of her children, Eugene and Hortense, both of whom had played vital roles in her life. Eugene, Napoleon's stepson, had become a prominent military leader in his own right, while Hortense had married Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, and given Joséphine grandchildren. The house at Malmaison, though quieter now, was a refuge of sorts, where she could step away from the memory of the emperor and the demands of a public life she had left behind. Yet, even in the solitude of Malmaison, Joséphine was never fully at peace. There were moments when she would wake in the middle of the night, her heart heavy with the loss of her once great love. There were also moments when the weight of her own decisions, the sacrifices she had made, and the choices that had been taken from her, felt unbearable. She had been a woman of strength, but in those moments of quiet reflection, she allowed herself to grieve, not only for the loss of Napoleon but for the loss of the future they had once dreamed of together. In 1815, Napoleon returned to France from his exile on Elba, seeking to reclaim his throne and revive the glory of his empire. For a brief, fleeting moment known as the 100 Days, the emperor returned to power, his charisma and military genius still capable of rallying the French people. But as quickly as his reign had begun, it ended in defeat at Waterloo. Napoleon was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the final years of his life. During this time, Joséphine remained in France, no longer the empress but still a woman of considerable influence and wealth. News of Napoleon's return stirred old memories, and there were rumors that Joséphine, despite her separation from him, might try to reconcile with the man who had once been her greatest love. But Joséphine, ever dignified, knew that those days were gone. The man she had once loved so fiercely was now a shadow of his former self, and the empire he had built was no more. In May 1814, while Napoleon was still at Elba, Joséphine fell ill. Her health had been deteriorating for some time, and the stress of her years divorced, estranged from her first love, and now living in a world that had changed beyond recognition, had taken its toll. Joséphine's death on May 29, 1814, was marked by a sense of finality. She had outlived Napoleon's empire, and her passing symbolized the end of an era. At her funeral, the courtiers and citizens who had once flocked to her side paid their respects. Some of them, no doubt, recalled the woman who had once been the dazzling Empress of the French, radiant in her elegance and grace. Others remembered Joséphine as the symbol of a France that had gone through revolution, empire, and exile, a woman whose life mirrored the rise and fall of a nation. As the years passed, the memory of Joséphine lived on. She had been a queen without a crown, a woman who had ruled not by birthright but through grace, intellect, and her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of her time. Her legacy was not only one of beauty and elegance but of strength, resilience, and the quiet dignity with which she faced her most difficult trials. In the final years of her life, Joséphine had found peace, not in the grandeur of empire, but in the simpler things, her children, her gardens at Malmaison, and the fleeting moments of quiet reflection. Though she had never borne Napoleon the son he so desperately wanted, she had given him something far more valuable: her unwavering support, her love, and her unwavering belief in the greatness of his dreams. And in the end, that was the truest legacy she could leave behind. Napoleon, too, would eventually fade into history, his once glorious empire reduced to mere memories. But the story of Joséphine de Beauharnais, the woman who had stood by his side, who had endured both the heights of imperial power and the depths of personal loss, would live on. Her name, like Napoleon's, would be etched into the pages of history not as a footnote, but as the story of a woman who had been both a queen and a survivor in a time of extraordinary upheaval.